Two great Hungarian 20th century composers frame today's concert, Zoltán Kodály and Béla Bartók. The first piece is Kodály's Dances of Galánta, written in 1933. This is, as it suggests, very much a celebration of Eastern European and particularly Hungarian gypsy folk music, and it's incredibly exhilarating and enjoyable. It also features a prominent solo for the clarinet. The clarinet here is doing an imitation of a Hungarian folk clarinet called the taragato. And so it's expected to play a little bit more wildly than usual. You're expecting a refined piece of Western classical music. But then Kodály, like Bartók, were very much aware of how much their own folk music roots went against all that was refined and polished and integrated and beautiful and high-toned, you might say, in Western classical music. They found something edgy and different and inspiring and musically liberating in the folk music of Hungary. I say the folk music of Hungary because Galánta is not actually now in Hungary. Those border shifts that keep going on in the 20th century for all sorts of tragic reasons means that it's now part of Slovakia. But it's still very much imbued with this extraordinary ethos and terrifically compelling. You don't need to know much just to get the feeling of the excitement. Only one little thing I'll point out. The Hungarian language is very, very emphatic on its first syllable, always bum on the first note. As it were, the first syllable of the word, and sometimes the words are quite long. That means that its vocal music and its dance music tends to reflect those rhythms. So you'll notice a lot of da-das and da-da-das in this piece. That's because this is music that's absolutely embedded in the sound of the Hungarian language. You could say it speaks Hungarian for that reason. Then we turn to Venezuela, and Pacho Flores, the brilliant Venezuelan trumpeter, then plays his own Cantos y Revueltas, a Fantasia concertante for trumpet and Venezuelan Cuatro, and with strings. A Cuatro is a guitar, it's a folk guitar with a distinctive sound and style of playing of its own. And this is music that's absolutely deeply embedded, not only in Venezuelan folk tunes, but also in the incredibly exciting and varied rhythms of the Caribbean. This, of course, is an amazing area for musical ferment. So much of the best music seems to come out of areas in which lots of different kinds of peoples with different cultures are thrown together and fascinating cross-relations start to happen between them. Incredibly fertile. And you'll hear that reflected in the exuberance and joyousness and dance energy of this concerto, or Fantasia concertante, I should say. And then a tiny piece, but full of flavour, by Astor Piazzolla, the great Argentinian master of the tango. Piazzolla has concentrated on the tango throughout his career, and you might have thought that might have made him repetitive, but it's absolutely astonishing how much variety he can get out of this simple, or is it simple, dance form. And in Revirado for trumpet and orchestra, you'll just hear how when someone's so deeply saturated in this mood and in the history, in the colours of a particular dance form, it can be incredibly fertile, which is exactly what Kodály and Bartók found too. Then, after the interval, comes one of the orchestral masterpieces of the 20th century, Béla Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra. Now, it's an interesting title, isn't it, Concerto for Orchestra? This is perhaps the most famous example of a work with this slightly confusing title. What's a concerto for orchestra? Some people have said it's almost really a symphony, this piece, and in some ways it is a symphony, there's no doubt about it. Yet at the same time, there's lots of fascinatingly interesting solo writing in this piece, show-off solo writing, so that everyone in the orchestra gets their fair turn in the spotlight. So it is on one level a piece about display and virtuosity. On another level, however, it is deeply serious, a deeply serious symphonic piece of work, and a very magnificent one too. When Bartók wrote it in 1943, he was in a pretty desperate situation. He had been, like Kodály, incredibly involved in the folk music of his native Hungary and its culture. He loved his homeland and had spent years collecting folk songs, and that left a very deep imprint on the style of his music. You may hear that from time to time in the Concerto for Orchestra. But by 1942, of course, World War II had broken out. Germany now occupied Hungary. Bartók had left, not knowing what on earth to do with himself, via Switzerland, as a lot of people did in those days, and ended up in America. Other composers fleeing all the horrors of Nazi-occupied Central Europe at the time had come to America too. Stravinsky, Paul Hindemith, Arnold Schoenberg. But they got big reputations behind them, and in a way America was ready to welcome them and make them its own. But Bartók, well, he had established a bit of a reputation as a very hardline modernist, but only in a very small circle of cognoscenti. He hadn't really made a big name for himself, and he found himself that when he arrived in America, he was pretty poor and pretty hard up for cash. He also found life in New York extremely difficult, a city that's so exciting for so many people. Bartók loved nature. There's a rather sad story of him walking rather depressedly along the street near Central Park and then suddenly looking up and smiling and saying, "Oh, I smell a horse." That contact with nature was so important that for a moment it brought him a flash of joy. But he did find great relief at a resort outside the city in the country at a place called Saranac Lake. And there the ideas started to come back. Including the ideas for this remarkable concerto. The conductor, Serge Koussevitzky, who was a very good talent spotter, had commissioned Bartók to write it, partly because he knew Bartók needed the money, but also because he had a hunch Bartók would come up with something really good, and he did. Bartók seems to have taken to the idea in America that classical music wasn't any more about a narrow coterie of intelligentsia writing challenging music to stimulate each other. It was for bigger audiences. It had to be for bigger audiences if it was going to work. And actually, having turned to this, he did it rather well. Because here's a piece that's remarkably original, very ingeniously structured, but at the same time really has a popular outreach. It's full of great tunes. It's tremendously exciting. It's full of colour. And at the end, there's an irresistible sense, rather rare in Bartók if you compare it to his early music, of a great shout of joy, as though actually just the experience of re-engaging with his creativity, even though he's in exile and very depressed about the fate of his homeland, has completely liberated something positive in him again. It's a tremendous moment. There's one little detail I ought to point out which might confuse you the first time. In the middle of the fourth movement, there are 5 movements, it's a kind of gigantic arch structure for this concerto. Suddenly, in the middle of what seems like rather beautiful Hungarian pastoral music, a clarinet enters with a strangely sort of, well, slightly trite and cheeky sounding little tune. Just like that. And it's greeted immediately with shouts and trills from muted trumpets, and later with a raspberry, there's no doubt about it, a very rude sound indeed from a glissando trombone. The rudest noise Bartók knew how to make. What's this about? Well, apparently Bartók was rather depressed by the extreme popularity during the war of Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, which had become a bit of a cult because it represented Russia's defiance against Nazi occupation. Was Bartók just being a bit jealous? Or did he actually really dislike that sort of whole communist positivity way of thinking and react against that? But it's also possible that he had something else in mind, because that little figure, da-dum-ba-dum-ba-dum-bum, is one of the hit tunes from the musical The Merry Widow by Lear, which Bartók probably knew was Hitler's favourite piece of music. Maybe that's what this is about. Maybe that's Bartók raising 2 fingers defiantly to the man who's created such havoc in the middle of the piece. That's what I'd like to think. And it would also explain how in the finale he is able to liberate himself through furious dancing to such a magnificently joyous ending. Alas, Bartók was already seriously ill when he wrote this concerto. He got leukemia. He eventually died the year after the premiere. And he wasn't very old either. It was a tragic ending when he was obviously looking forward to doing so much. But I'm glad that he was able to hear this concerto performed and able to hear the terrific success that it scored, that shout of joy at the end had such a marvellous response from the audience, that the audience were able to hear it and welcome it. That's one consolation in those dreadful years.